The individual who removes the self-equation from the weighing of experience becomes receptive to an increasing inflow of facts, of realities, of things as they actually are. And as fact is the food of consciousness, good food, well prepared, makes possible the growth of consciousness. It is very much as though we again think on the level of food and eating. Suppose we have a very fine garden in which we grow many splendid fruits and vegetables. We also have a very happy individual who likes and enjoys good food. So we seat the individual at the table, place the plate in front of him, and bring in the meal. But between the garden and the customer, the food has gone through the kitchen. It has passed through the modifying circumstances of the cook. The very best food can be ruined in the kitchen and can appear on the table in such a lamentable condition that no one can eat it. On the other hand, food which might at first not seem too promising, with the skill of the chef, becomes a great and delightful delicacy. So the chef becomes important. And between the man's spiritual diet and the final self-consciousness which must eat the food is the chef, consisting of man's total mental and emotional organism, which can either prepare this food tastefully or make it unpalatable and totally indigestible. This means that the temperament and the disposition of the person determines the acceptability of the finished product. Through contemplation, we try to make possible that the distribution of realities within the nature of the individual is as complete as possible. We try to make sure that nothing that is valuable is lost, and also nothing that is unreal is permitted to pass on into consciousness to become the source of pressure. Now, what is our contemplative problem, factually? Contemplation is man's ability to relax to the consideration of experience. It is the individual trying to, for a moment at least, take on the impartial, impersonal attitude of a jurist, sitting down quietly with the fact, or with the day, or with the life, or with the problem, and trying to understand it without self-interest. Always remembering that the traditional figure of justice is blindfolded, so that it will not be influenced by appearances. So the individual must escape from appearances and search only for those things which are essentially true. And arriving at truth must have the courage to accept it, and by so doing incorporate it into his self-consciousness mechanism. Now, he will not and cannot at this stage of his growth completely eliminate self, because after all, self is the very mechanism upon which he must depend for all of his energies. But he can reduce the abnormal and unreasonable elements of self-pressure and bring himself into the normalcy range for the humanity at the degree of evolution which ours has reached. Once he is within the normalcy range, he will find that most of his troubles rapidly diminish. They will not diminish, however, simply from battling and pressure on the level of error. The simplest method of contemplation, therefore, is to substitute it for these various critical, negative, interpretive processes that we normally, instinctively employ. Man spends far more time than he realizes in self-pity, in gossip, in criticism, in worry, and in fear. All of this time is a total loss. And when we take this type of time out of man's life, we make a considerable hole in his available energy resources. These are all forms of contemplation, by the way, but they are false forms. He is using the same energies in self-pity that he would be likely to use in self-analysis. Contemplation is the acceptance of experience also as basic education. For after all, as man's mind may be trained in school, his self or his ego is trained in the school of experience. If he rejects experience, he fails to grow inwardly. And when his mind, emotions, and body grow more rapidly than his person, we then have the inconsistencies and the terrible dangers that we confront when skill exceeds integrity. And this can happen in anyone's life to a certain measure and degree. So by contemplation, the mystic, the Eastern saint and scholar, means a period set aside to quietude. The individual finding an oasis of calm in a desert of confusion. He sits down quietly, begins to think through the purpose for himself, his origin, his nature, his destiny, and begins to measure his larger needs in terms of his smaller ones. He begins to think through the question of what will tomorrow be like if we do nothing about it. And he may even ask himself if he has the courage to endure another 20 or 30 years of the same kind of living that is burdening him today. By degrees, out of the confusion, there begins to emerge a pattern. And this pattern is basically a very simple one. Namely, that if we want to be better, we must do something about it. Once having come to this rather obvious, but at the same time rarely experienced decision, the individual must vitalize that decision. It is not enough that he shall decide that sometime he will do something about it, and then promptly forget the whole thing. It is necessary for this decision to be vitalized by the flow of libido or energy, so that it becomes a positive path of purpose. Usually, nature gives us this incentive out of desperation. The individual reaches finally a climax in which he must change, because the situation is too painful and too impossible to endure any longer. Man does not have to wait, however, for this ultimate. He may choose to make certain improvements at any time he so desires. Now he must also bear in mind that these changes and these improvements do not represent the neglect of anything else. It is not a long and arduous procedure so that he must quit work or do anything of so strenuous a nature. It merely represents the gradual development of an attitude. Now man works and plays and lives and even sleeps with attitude. We each of us have a prevalent attitude which dominates our conduct no matter whether we realize it or not. It's there every minute. The point to be achieved, of course, is that this attitude should be the constructive, contemplative attitude, not something that we engender for 15 minutes in the evening or something of that nature, but a continuous attitude, just as our present critical thinking is continuous, or our dissatisfaction is continuous, or our tendency to fear is continuous. These negative attitudes are with us always, and it is only right that positive attitudes should also be with us always. For one positive attitude can dissolve many negative ones. Contemplation is thus the gradual acceptance of a lawful universe, a reasonable purpose for self, and an understanding of the laws that govern the conduct of self, so that whether we are consciously aware or not, we are instinctively doing the right thing rather than the wrong thing. That instinctively we are kind. Instinctively we are progressive. Not because we have fought out the problem of unkindness, but because through a gradual interpretation of experience, we have justified the fact of kindness. We have realized and learned and known that these positive things are true, that they are dependable, and that upon them we should build our living. If then we begin to think first a little, then perhaps a little more, along these lines, taking positive, constructive, creative relationships to life, these will become habitual. And constructive contemplation is a habit which once developed will never be rejected. Because with this comes the gradual unfoldment and growth of the person, who is therefore compatible with himself and with his body and with his world. He also finds that the correction of these pressures will not only result in emotional and mental happiness, but will increase bodily efficiency and will free the mind from destructive habits which detract from its creativity and productivity on every level. The individual burdened with fear, grief, suspicion, and jealousy can do no job as well as he could if he did not have these detriments. And as long as living is an experience which should be met with every possible creative and constructive attitude, there is no reason for persons to drag themselves through the years burdened by their own thinking. To realize this, to know it, is to begin to improve and to change. But of course the important factor always is that all growth, contemplative and otherwise, must begin with a statement of faith. Man must believe in the good to be attained, because he cannot begin with the good. If he could begin with the good, the growth would be unnecessary. But as growth must terminate in good, the individual must grow because of faith in good. Now, this type of faith is not indefinite. It does not mean that he must go on year after year believing something that he can never prove. If faith is real, it requires only one direct expression of itself before confirming evidence begins to be available. The individual, therefore, who, realizing through a faith that is within him that good is attainable, and having certain proof even of this in the lives of other persons who have lived better than he has, he needs only to have this basic statement of faith. The moment he applies it, it becomes involved in his interpretation mechanism. And then everything that happens to him will prove the validity of his new attitude. As his understanding grows, he will have more and more proof by interpretation of the value and fact of this condition in the universe around him. He will find that these various experiences and impacts which he has passed through will begin to tell him the story of faith instead of the story of fear. He will find that beneath the phobia that he had is a friendly universe he has never known. He will discover that to the degree that he is a friend, he will have a friend. And that moment the capacity for true friendship arises in him, he will recognize it in others. The moment he has a capacity for peace within his own nature, he will experience peace. And he will also find that others have this capacity. And various doubts and fears and conflicts on religious and philosophical questions will disappear from his experience. He will discover through the interpretive power that he has that the universe will support with its full strength and full measure all of his constructive instincts. All right, you may say, what have we here then but two forms of self-hypnosis? The individual being miserable, found through interpretation a miserable universe. Another individual being happy, found through interpretation a happy universe. Then what is the universe? Is it merely, again, an expression of what we see? Buddha would say yes, that the universe is happy or unhappy according to us, for we are the maker and breaker of all patterns which affect us. But there is one other point which is of some modern scientific interest. If we want to say that both of these things are not provable in themselves, and therefore we have no more right to say the universe is good than we have to say that it is bad. We have no more right to assume that happiness is less of a delusion than misery. Let us point out that nature gives us the answer. Nature reserves for those with the constructive approach every reward conceivable in factual things, and punishes the negative approach with every penalty conceivable. Therefore, nature is telling us, false or true, real or unreal, that nature wishes us to enter into this state of positive adjustment with existence. Nature cannot be denied. The individual who takes the negative attitude has ulcers. The individual who takes the positive attitude does not have ulcers. The attitudes may be an illusion, but an ulcer is a little more tangible. Nature is reserving always every reward for the individual who is positively creative. And nature is forever spanking the individual who is negatively destructive. So there must be more to it than two delusions, because man's growth is not a delusion. His security and his integrities are not delusions. For by them factual things are accomplished, and delusions do not produce facts. They produce only other delusions. The choice, then, of either drifting along with negative thinking or affirming association with constructive endeavor is a choice between sickness and health, between misery and security. And also, in the experience of mankind, it is the decision between destructivity and constructivity. The great work of the world has been done by idealists. The great tragedies of mankind have been committed by persons with inadequate ideals. Thus progress, essential progress, such as we have of it, belongs to those who have chosen to cling to inner truth. Under such conditions, we cannot assume that misery and happiness are equally illusions. We can say that false happiness based upon passing inaccurate decisions can be illusionary because it will pass away. But happiness which results from the interior growth of the individual and represents essential progress brings him nearer and nearer to an ideal state and advances every cause with which human society has been essentially concerned since the beginning of history. We cannot assume, therefore, that such a thing is an illusion. If it is an illusion, and everything is an illusion, then it is obviously a good thing for man to choose that illusion which is of the greatest good to himself and others. Any way you wish to look at it, on any level of interpretation, of acceptance or unbelief, man's constructive addiction to a sincere search for realities and an acceptance within himself that realities are good and that the service of them are the core and source of man's security. These things are rational, reasonable, factual attitudes. So contemplation, active contemplation, is man's approach to life upon this level. The gradual allowing of this attitude to take over and to gradually overcome the negative, destructive, separating attitudes which plague him. And if he does this, he will then find that the entire inner psychic life unfolds like the flower, that the self-consciousness becomes a radiant and beautiful thing like the lotus of the Hindu, in which the eternal being is enthroned as Buddha is seated in the heart of the lotus. Man's five sensory perceptions become five supports of consciousness, and consciousness in turn becomes the basic power or medium by which man can begin to apperceive that which lies beyond self-consciousness and can grow toward it and can build a fuller and more enlightened existence. On these foundations, the psychological reflections of the future must be built, for we've got to finally realize that man's misery and his peace, his fall and his redemption are involved within his own nature. And this is the reason why there is justice. No one can be the victim of the injustice of another. Each individual is the victim of the inadequacy of himself. And building strongly and serenely upon this, the person has the active incentives not to leave his growth to providence, but to assail the problem himself and realize that he can win, and by winning can have a life that is more abundant and a hope that is more real and an orientation in the universe that brings him closer to God and to man. And on these foundations, a new level of contemplative integrity is available to him almost immediately. Time's up.